When we are thinking about developing assessment that is inclusive of all learners, we are considering the achievement standards in the Australian curriculum. Here is the definition from the ACARA website of the achievement standards. Now let's have a look at the definition of equity from ACARA. The term they use is on the same basis. The definition consists of 4 different criteria. Let's have a look at the 4 criteria. What stands out to you? What stands out to me is the reference to age equivalent learning content. In other words, the content descriptors of the student's year level are taught and modeled. The students can then demonstrate up and down the achievement standards. It talks about students' strengths and barriers to learning, so it's really important that teachers know their students' strengths and barriers to the learning process. What is of significance for me is in the 4th criteria where it refers to rigorous. It's not talking about academic rigor, it's talking about that the teacher ensures that when they teach the content descriptors and assess the achievement standards, they're in line with the curriculum, not adding superfluous variables or taking things away and not teaching the curriculum. What also is of significance to me is the reference to relevant and engaging. Is the learning and the assessment relevant for the student, or is it relevant for the teacher? And when it talks about engaging, is it engaging for the learner or is it engaging for the teacher? Now let's have a look at an example achievement standard from Year 7 Australian Curriculum version 9 English. Students identify how text structures, language features, including literary devices and visual features, shape meaning. We first start by identifying any cognitive verbs within the achievement standards. I like to highlight them so they stand out in this process. To define the cognitive verbs, we use the Australian curriculum glossaries. We don't use glossaries for senior schooling in Queensland or any other glossary. We use the glossaries for the Australian curriculum to ensure that we're using the curriculum rigorously. If we look at the glossaries for the learning area and the definition of the cognitive verb is not there, we don't make it up or go to a regular dictionary. We need to find it within the Australian curriculum. From my experience, the best glossary is HPE. I believe it's because HPE doesn't have the content knowledge, so they have most of the definitions of the skills within the Australian curriculum. We first start by identifying any cognitive verbs within the achievement standards. I like to highlight them so they stand out in this process. In this example achievement standard, we need to work out what text structures, language features, including literary devices and visual features, are appropriate for a Year 7 student to demonstrate against the achievement standard. So to do that, we need to go to the achievement standard in the Australian Curriculum version 9 website, click on it, then go down to the content descriptors, look at the content descriptors, see if it tells us anything about the appropriate text structures, language features, literary devices, or visual features. Once we've looked at the content descriptors, we then need to go into the elaborations and have a look if any further ones are named, remembering that all elaborations are optional, but it gives you ideas of what is appropriate for a Year 7 student in English to demonstrate in terms of those text structures, language features, literary devices, and visual features. By following this process, looking at the content descriptors and elaborations, we can see there is reference to extended metaphors, chronology, taxonomies, cause and effect, suffixes, prefixes, complex and compound complex sentences, vectors, angles, social distance, specialist and technical knowledge, and colon and brackets. Now we start fleshing out frameworks for students to demonstrate the achievement standard. If we come back to the definition of identify, which is to recognize or name someone or something, that tells us what we're kind of looking for in terms of our framework. Because the cognitive verb in this case is identify at a C standard, students could circle the language features, text structure, or literary devices used within the text they're examining, or point to them. They don't have to write them. They don't have to memorize them. They could simply circle or point to the language features, text structures, or literary devices that are used within the text they're examining. Continuing with the definition of identify within the Australian curriculum, which is to recognise or name someone or something, students could then provide examples of the language features, text structures, and literary devices they have circled that have been used within the text. Because the achievement standard does not use the word write, the response doesn't have to be written. Students could handwrite, they could type, they could have a scribe, they could use speech-to-text software to provide these examples. But once again, because the cognitive verb and the achievement standard doesn't have a reference to write, students could also verbally provide their response in terms of the examples used in the text. Often teachers will say then, how do I provide evidence that they've done this? If a student is providing a verbal response, the teacher could video using a school device the student's response, or they could use audio recording on a school device. We now need to go back to the achievement standard to make sure that we're hitting all of the requirements of the achievement standard. The achievement standard didn't just require students to identify, which is name or recognize the text structures, language features, including literary devices and visual features used. It also, they have to recognize how they shape the meaning of text. So that's important that we include that in our framework. Once again, because there is no reference to the word write in the achievement standard or the definition of the cognitive verb, how students could demonstrate this achievement standard is quite broad. Students might handwrite, they might type, they might use speech to text, they might have a scribe, but they can also, once again, verbally provide a response in which teachers should think about how they collect that evidence of learning, for example, through video or through audio recording. This framework allows students to demonstrate a C standard against the achievement standard. However, one of the interesting things about the Australian curriculum, it never tells us what a B and an A looks like. In some schools, a B and an A keeps the achievement standard cognitive verb the same and looks for more complexity. But in this case, it's really hard to increase the cognitive verb of identify to give it more complexity. So what we can do is we can look at pushing the cognitive verb up to higher levels for the B and the A. Let's have a look at how we do that. When we're determining B's and A's against the achievement standards, we don't want to just make them up. We want to use some reference point. So in this case, we can use cognitive verbs in the Australian Curriculum QCAA resource. We don't want to use the PDF document because that's the definition of the skills in the Year 11 and 12 Queensland curriculum. When we click on the first link, we scroll to the bottom of the page and select the Year 7 to 10 toolkit because we are looking at a Year 7 achievement standard. Because the cognitive verb is identify in the achievement standard, we scroll down and click on identify. We then select the first PDF document. We then scroll to the bottom of the first page and the top of the second page. There's a box of the cognitive skills below identify and above, and we can use those ones above to determine our B's and A's. In this case, the options are explain, compare, and critique. So our B might be compare and our A might be critique. And this is what we use to further flesh out our scaffold for students to demonstrate their learning against the achievement standard. To flesh out the B's and A's in our scaffold, we need to define the cognitive verbs from the QCAA Cognitive Verb Toolkit. In this case, compare and critique. We then add these to our scaffold to provide opportunities for students to demonstrate B's and A's against the achievement standard. When using this scaffold to allow students to demonstrate evidence of learning against the achievement standard, it's really important to remember that the achievement standard and the definitions of the cognitive verbs do not use the term right. As such, there is freedom on how students provide evidence of learning against this achievement standard. Once we tie it to a specific way of demonstrating the achievement standard, this could be a potential barrier to the learning process for students. So when we look at the cognitive verb identify, which is name or recognize someone or something, students could point to or circle the language features, text structure, and literary devices used within the text. When providing examples in the text and how they shape meaning, as well as how they are similar or different in which was used most effectively, the term right is not used in the achievement standard or the definitions of the cognitive verbs. So students could write, they could handwrite, they could type, they could use speech to text or have a scribe, but they also could verbally provide their responses. Once again, for teachers, it's really important to think about how they allow their students to provide evidence of learning against the achievement standard and how they will collect this evidence. In this case, if a student provides a verbal response, a teacher could video the student providing that verbal response, or they could record it in terms of an audio file and then save it somewhere in their database.